Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am creating a card for my mom. Today is her birthday, so happy birthday, Mom. She'll already have this card by the time the video posts, so she has already seen it. She has been asking me to make a black and white card with gold embossing. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring today. I am using the Beautiful Flowers stamp set by Simon Says Stamp, and this is available as a separate stamp set, but it was also part of a card kit a few months back. I'm working on a piece of campton watercolor paper here, and I'm stamping this with my Misty just because I know I'm going to have to stamp this multiple times. I'm stamping with Intense Black ink by Simon Says Stamp, and I did have to end up stamping this, I think, 3 times just to make sure that I got a really good impression. Normally when I watercolor, I would use like a no-line ink or maybe a distress ink, but being I want these to appear to be black and white, I'm not worried about the black outline. I'm using these Daniel Smith watercolors here, and I just buy the samples because it's a lot cheaper. And I'll just show you a little bit of the watercoloring here. I'm working on one petal at a time. I'm doing really simple watercoloring here because the illustration, these stamps are so intricate and so detailed. You don't really have to do a lot of shading. The stamp does it for you. So I'm laying out some clean water with a damp paintbrush on one petal at a time and then dropping in a little bit of my color. And I'm using the Lunar Black for the flowers and the buds. And I'm just dabbing down some of that color right where the darkest areas will be. So mainly where the petals are kind of laying underneath another petal. The lines within the stamp will show you exactly where your shading will be, and being the watercolor dries back and lightens up as it dries, those lines will still be visible. So that's the reason why you really don't need a whole lot of shading here. Those lines are still going to appear through the paint. Now you'll see that I'll go back to some of the petals that I've already worked on and either maybe spread out the color a little bit more, add a little bit more, or maybe even take some color away. Watercoloring is very forgiving. You can always switch it up. You can use a damp paper towel to dab up any mistakes that you've made. You can go back in and add more color, especially when it's still damp. It will spread on its own. So all of this blending, the paper and the water is doing it all on its own. I'm working on petals here that are separated from one another. I don't want to work on 2 petals that are touching while one petal is still wet. And I'll continue to basically paint all of these petals and buds the same exact way. Then we'll move on to the leaves. I didn't want to go with the same color for the leaves just because I didn't want them to blend in. So I'm using the sepia, I think it's pronounced. And this is also part of the same sample card here of the Daniel Smith watercolors. And I'm going directly over the stem here, and I'm obviously not going to do any blending there. It's such a small area. I'm laying down some of the color on the base of each of the petals where it would be the darkest, where it meets that branch. Then going in with my damp paintbrush and spreading that out. Now you want to make sure that your paintbrush is not overly wet. The results will be different when it dries. So you might have the little puddles that are created when it dries. It will still look like those puddles are still there. So you just want to make sure that your paintbrush is not overly wet. For these larger flower or leaves over here, I'm just putting down my color again on the base of the leaf and right up the center. Like I said before, those lines within the stamp are going to create your shading for you. Then I'll go back in with a damp paintbrush again and blend that out. Now you'll see here that I'm adding a little bit more color just because, like I said, when it dries, it lightens up. So you can always go back in and add more. Here I'm going to add just a little bit more color on the tip of the leaf so it makes it look like it's kind of bowed out or curved a little bit. And I'll go through and add color to all of the stems and leaves pretty much the same way. just remember to do the stems of the buds too. I forgot those and had to go back. I also added a little bit of the sepia to the middle of the flowers where the stamen were, and I didn't do any kind of shading there. It's a really tiny area. I just dropped in some color to kind of have a differentiation between the flower and the center. Once all my coloring was done here, I made sure that my panel was completely dry, and I'm going to take my T-square ruler and an emboss it pen and just draw 2 straight lines on the bottom and the top. Here's where I forgot to use my anti-static tool, so I knew I was going to have a little bit of a problem here, but it ended up not being too bad. Next, I'll take some gold embossing powder, and this is by Ranger. And you can see on that top line here where I forgot to use that anti-static tool, I did have a little bit of a problem with some of the embossing powder sticking to areas I didn't want it to. I just took a dry paintbrush, and I have a paintbrush that's pretty much specifically for things like this, and cleaned up some of those areas. I did smudge a little bit with my finger there because obviously it was not heat set yet. So I just added a little bit more embossing powder, cleaned that up with my paintbrush, and went ahead and heat set that. Now for my sentiment, I'm going to be using a sentiment that is also part of this stamp set, and I wanted to have this embossed in the same gold embossing powder. These are 2 separate stamps, so I'm using the large happy and the small birthday. In order to get my placement down, I'll stamp just the one word and sprinkle on my embossing powder so I can actually see it. I'm not using my MISTI here. Normally when I stamp on watercolor paper, I would use a stamp positioner, but I find when you're using Versamark ink, I don't really have a problem getting a good impression the first time. So I'll go ahead and stamp that large happy and sprinkle that with my gold embossing powder, then move on to the tiny little birthday word and stamp that directly underneath the happy and heat set both of them. It does help when you take the lid off your embossing powder before you sprinkle that on. I recorded this at like 4 o'clock in the morning, so I was a little out of it. Once I had my sentiment down and embossed, I cleaned up some of the smudges that I had from, I believe I got it from my MISTI because my MISTI is filthy. I haven't cleaned it. And I just used a sand eraser to kind of take those areas up. Once everything was dry, I did adhere this to an A2 size note card. And that is it for today, guys. Happy birthday, Mom. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.